The problem of other minds is the philosophical puzzle of how we can ever truly know that anyone besides ourselves possesses conscious thought. We cannot directly observe another human's subjective experience. When we apply this barrier to an entirely different species, the challenge scales into an epistemological crisis. In 1944, researchers Fritz Heider and Marianne Simmel demonstrated our brain's inescapable tendency to project intentionality. When human subjects watched simple geometric shapes moving erratically around a box, they immediately assigned the shapes motives, anger, and fear. We automatically project complex mental states onto meaningless motion. This psychological bias is called anthropomorphism, the attribution of human traits to non-human entities. In scientific observation, it acts as a relentless generator of false positives. If human vision can be tricked into seeing aggressive intent in a bouncing triangle, our raw intuition about the behavior of a dog or an ape is hopelessly contaminated. Charles Darwin looked at the animal kingdom and saw mental continuity. He argued that the cognitive differences between humans and other animals are a matter of degree, not of kind. Later researchers systematically rejected Darwin's anecdotal, romantic perspective. The 20th century behaviorist movement demanded strict mechanistic observation of behavior, actively stripping away any assumptions of a subjective inner life. Because the human brain is hardwired to confabulate narratives, researchers realized they could not trust raw intuition to evaluate intelligence. Science required a rigid new rulebook to enforce objectivity and filter out our own psychological biases. That rulebook was anchored by Morgan's Canon. Formulated by C. Lloyd Morgan, the rule dictates that an action must never be interpreted as the outcome of a higher psychological faculty if it can be explained by a lower, simpler associative process. This principle functions as Occam's razor, the philosophical rule that the simplest explanation is usually the correct one, applied directly to cognitive science. It crowned simplicity as the ultimate scientific virtue in comparative psychology. This framework establishes basic associative learning, like a pigeon pecking a lever for a food reward, as the default null hypothesis for all non-human behavior. This assumption shifts the entire burden of proof onto complex explanations. An animal is presumed to be operating on mindless stimulus-response loops, unless overwhelming experimental evidence forces researchers to credit it with rational thought. The problem is that natural selection does not optimize for sterile simplicity. Evolutionary processes are messy, highly redundant, and chaotic. There is no biological mandate that the easiest explanation for a behavior is the most accurate one. By legally equating the simplest associative explanation with the objective truth, comparative psychology traded human projection for a massive, theory-laden blind spot. To see this blind spot in action, look at the mirror self-recognition test, long considered the scientific gold standard for proving self-awareness. An animal is marked with odorless paint and placed in front of a mirror to see if it investigates its own reflection. This experimental diagram bakes in highly specific, value-laden assumptions. It requires the subject to rely primarily on vision, and it requires the subject to actually care about an unexpected blemish on its physical appearance. Gorillas routinely fail this test. They do not investigate the mark. However, in gorillas' social structures, direct eye contact is perceived as a threat. They avoid looking in the mirror to prevent a fight, effectively failing the test regardless of their actual internal self-awareness. Dogs fail the visual mirror test. Yet when researchers designed an equivalent olfactory mirror test using scent marking, these same dogs easily succeeded. They recognize themselves precisely through smell, their primary sensory modality. Compare this to the tiny cleaner wrasse, a fish that successfully passes the visual mirror test by attempting to scrape the mark off its scales. The wrasse passes because the mark mimics a parasite. In this fish's specific ecological reality, its Umwelt, a visual parasite is highly relevant and demands immediate physical interaction. When scientists design human-centric metrics and definitively declare that animals lack a cognitive ability because they fail our specific tests, they commit anthropectomy. This is the unscientific, false denial that humans and animals share capacities. The mirror self-recognition test does not measure a universal benchmark of cognition. It measures how closely an animal's sensory priorities match human visual vanity. Avoiding anthropomorphism at all costs creates a secondary structural paradox in evolutionary biology.
Researchers are forced to choose between two conflicting definitions of simplicity. Cognitive parsimony assumes the absolute simplest mental mechanism for a behavior. Evolutionary parsimony assumes the fewest possible evolutionary mutations across a family tree. Relying strictly on cognitive parsimony requires scientists to invent distinct parallel mechanisms for closely related species. If a human and a chimpanzee perform the same task, this rule demands we credit the human with complex thought, but force the chimpanzee to use a separate, mechanically simpler behavioral algorithm. Conversely, evolutionary parsimony dictates that because humans and chimpanzees share a recent common ancestor, the simplest biological explanation is that a single mechanism for social cognition developed in that ancestor and was inherited by both branches. Simplicity is not a singular mathematical truth. The concept fractures into competing, mutually exclusive domains, depending entirely on what the scientist chooses to simplify. Strictly adhering to Morgan's canon forces scientists to violate basic evolutionary logic, demanding biological absurdity to maintain psychological rigor. The ultimate test case for this fractured version of Occam's razor is the chimpanzee theory of mind controversy. This diagram shows the mind-reading hypothesis. A chimpanzee sees a competitor, infers what that competitor can see, and alters its own behavior to secure the food first. This model requires a single mental state attribution. It implies the animal has a concept of another mind, directly aligning with evolutionary continuity and human cognition. Now look at the competing behavior reading hypothesis. Here, the chimpanzee operates without attributing any internal mental states to the competitor at all. Instead, the animal processes a dense algorithmic flow. It calculates the competitor's bodily orientation, maps the geometry of their gaze line, and applies specific learned behavioral rules to those physical cues. When mapped side by side, Path B removes thoughts about thoughts, achieving representational parsimony. Path A maintains shared biological traits, achieving evolutionary parsimony. This creates a scientific stalemate. Both camps fiercely defend their model as the definitively simpler explanation. Empirical data cannot resolve this dispute. Both the simple mental model and complex behavioral algorithm perfectly predict the exact same physical results in the laboratory. When Occam's razor fractures, scientific interpretation stops being a matter of objective data and becomes a hidden philosophical choice. This epistemological problem extends far beyond primate studies. It dictates how we evaluate intelligence in completely alien nervous systems. Consider the concept of multiple realizability, the philosophical thesis that the same cognitive functions can be produced by entirely different physical structures. An octopus uses a highly decentralized nervous system to process complex information, proving that a centralized brain is not a strict requirement for intelligence. Historical assumptions linking physical brain size to intelligence fail completely when confronted with empirical evidence of mathematical addition and subtraction in invertebrates like honeybees. How researchers write the operational definitions for abstract terms like empathy or culture dictates in advance which taxa will be scientifically credited with those capacities. For example, if researchers define cumulative culture as requiring a human-like tendency to over-imitate useless, causally irrelevant actions, they actively rig their cognitive tests against species that learn to solve problems more efficiently. The philosophical assumptions baked into scientific methodologies act as a filter, actively shaping the boundaries of the natural world we are willing to acknowledge. The academic debate over cognitive parsimony carries direct, real-world consequences for the assignment of moral status and ethical treatment. Recognizing capacities like pain reception, episodic memory, or future planning in an animal triggers utilitarian moral obligations to protect them from suffering. Finding evidence of multimodal communication shifts the debate further, moving the conversation past animal welfare into questions of political agency and interspecies democracy. The legal and political definition of personhood is entirely dependent on which specific cognitive metrics a society chooses to scientifically validate. Before we can objectively map the minds of other species, we must aggressively audit the philosophical architecture of our own science. Misreading animal minds creates a cascading epistemological failure that corrupts our ethical relationship with the rest of the living world.